So when I got the topic from Long, I was asking myself exactly what is data economy, and turns out that people have talked about that for a long time. And for example, the European Commission has a 2014 report defining the data economy as an ecosystem that involves different types of players interacting with each other in the digital single market. Okay, so in their definition, they're talking about good quality, reliable, and interoperable data sets, including the infrastructure supporting that, as well as improved framework conditions that would facilitate value generation from data sets. I think that's pretty consistent with what Long has talked about. They also imagine a lot of application areas where improved big data handling can make a difference. We already see a lot of that happening. And in the US, similarly, the US Bureau of Economic Analysis have tried to define data economy by 4 components: the infrastructure in information communication technology, the e-commerce, which means transactions of goods and services remotely rather than offline in the same location, and also price digital services. A prime example of that will be cloud computing. They also include the digital services provided by federal government. This is non-defense government agencies. So both EU and the US try to measure the data economy. For example, US has measured as of 2021, saying that its data economy account for about 10% of the US GDP. It grows about 10% from 2020 in real terms, which is much faster than the US GDP growth in the same time. And it also accounts for 8 million jobs. On the right in the pie chart, you can see when they decompose this into the different components, infrastructure account for about 31%, price digital services account for about 43%, e-commerce for about 25%. The digital services provided by federal government is very important, but in volume is actually very small, account for less than 0.01%. And similarly in Europe, the European Data Market Study as of 2023 says that the data economy account for about 4% of the EU 27 GDP, which is almost 9% growth from 2021. So you can see in both US and Europe, the data economy grows faster than the general economy. It accounts for a lot of jobs. And in the future, it's imaginable that data economy will become more and more important. And if we just look at e-commerce, this is e-commerce report from the US Census. You can see the e-commerce as a fraction of retail has grown steadily over time, but there is a permanent jump in 2020 because of the pandemic. So another study from the think tank McKinsey, they have shown that the pandemic has sped up companies' overall adoption of digital technology. The acceleration is about by 3 to 7 years. Okay, very interesting. They have a graph showing how different companies fare in this kind of race for digital technology. On the very right, you can see these blue stars are representing 2021 top decile sort of leaders in tech-enabled companies. The gray dots are sort of the top leaders in 2018. So if you compare 2021, 2018, the 2021 has advanced much more as compared to 2018. Okay, that's thanks to the pandemic. That's for the top companies. For the overall respondents in their McKinsey survey, the average are the dark black dots, right? You can see the averages have even surpassed the top ones in 2018 before the pandemic. However, they're still lagged behind the top ones in 2021. So it's like everybody is in the race and the top ones seems like leading the race with even bigger gap with the average. So in this environment, it's natural for regulators to say, okay, given the importance of data economy, does the government need to intervene, right? And the principle from economics perspective is we're not going to intervene until we see market failures. And these are the 4 classical market failures: market power, externality, asymmetric information, bounded rationality. To be honest, if you look at the literature, there has been talks in each one of those for market failures in the data economy. And today I want to emphasize that I think the most straightforward market failure here are asymmetric information and externality. What I mean by asymmetric information, I think we are all data subjects. It's very natural for us to understand that we are at the disadvantage of information here. The data firms know much more about data collection, data storage, data use, how the data is shared, and the security of the data. However, I would also want to emphasize that data firms like Alibaba does not know all the information. Okay, there are other information that digital platforms know even less than some of the players. For example, fake reviews, that's the platform may not know exactly what's the purpose behind the review. I mean, what's the strategic reason? Are they fake or not? Well, some of the players may know those information, okay? So I just want to emphasize that that's asymmetric information actually cut both ways. If you look at externality, I think there are at least 3 types of externalities that the regulators may want to pay attention to. The first is pretty obvious. That's unintended use, and typically by cyber criminals, right? That's the data digital platforms was there to facilitate trade, to facilitate legitimate use, match between buyers and sellers, and so forth. However, those infrastructure has also been used by criminals in terms of cyber attacks, identity theft, extortion, stalking, and so forth. So this is sort of obviously that's a negative externality. Unfortunately, firms may not have full incentive to incorporate that externality, even if they could be victim of that. For example, that's okay, if I'm not putting very stringent measures on data security and I have a data breach, okay, maybe the firm can claim they're a victim as well. I mean, indeed, they're a victim of those cyber attacks. However, from the consumer's perspective, you actually don't know who have leaked your information, okay? And so there's like a general pollution problem that's at the user end, you know you're suffering from this, but you cannot attribute who is responsible for this data breach. Is that the criminal? Is that the data security measures are not good enough, and so forth. So that's going to generate a natural free riding in that externality. The second type of externality is, I would call it intended use, but exploited by bad players. The platforms, for example, social media, their intended use is to facilitate communication between different players. However, when that function has been exploited by some bad players, it could be terrorists are uploading some video, try to recruit the next worker for their organization, and some sex trafficking criminals may try to find their victims through those social media platforms and so forth. So again, the platforms may or may not have the full incentive to combat this externality, because in some sense they benefit from this because they cut a commission. They may have more advertising by more usage, regardless of exactly what the purpose of that usage. The third one is even more subtle. That's we could have legitimate users using the data economy, using the service provided by digital platforms. However, it could generate social consequences like teenage addiction or misuse of the platforms. There may be political polarization after different parties using the same platform. There could be discrimination or algorithm bias. So in light of these market failures, the natural question is, what regulators have done. Okay, so this picture is showing that's GDPR, that's the General Data Protection Regulation by EU, was put in place in 2018. That's covered most of the European area, but we have seen 16 other countries around the world try to kind of follow their step, have similar regulation. That would include, for example, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, South Africa, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. If we dive more into this picture, I put them into 4 categories. The blue ones here just representing the countries subject to GDPR. And the green ones are the ones that Europe actually acknowledged what they call adequate protection of privacy in other countries. So that would include Canada, Argentina, Japan, South Korea, Israel, New Zealand, and so forth. There are other 15 countries and regions such as India, Russia, China, Turkey, Australia, and so forth that have some version of data protection, of data privacy and data security laws, but they have not been acknowledged by EU as equivalent or adequate data protection. And US is a very complicated picture. There's no federal law governing privacy, although there are some industry-specific laws such as HIPAA for healthcare, or GLB for financial sector, or COPPA for privacy protection of underage people. Okay, so in the last 5 minutes, let me try to give you some summary of exactly what's in these data regulations and how effective are they in addressing the market failures. So the first one is the regulation target asymmetric information. I think this is the most straightforward, right? We know one party knows more than the other. The state just going to force the first party to give more information to the second party. So in practice, we have seen, for example, firms need to have a privacy policy, okay? And it need to get consent from consumers, from data users. The data subjects would have rights in to know how the data is collected, what's the data used, and would have the rights to delete the data, to correct the data, to copy the data, or even move the data from one place to another. If a data breach happens, most of the countries actually require mandatory report of data breach. For example, in India, they even require that the report has to be within 6 hours of the party knowing the violation. Israel would require registration of some database with the government. Okay, so that sounds very straightforward and promising. However, we also see catches in each one of them. Okay, so for example, very few people read the privacy policy at all, and most of us just go to the end of the page and click I agree. And we know there's a huge difference between whether I agree means opt-in or opt-out. Opt-in means that you have to explicitly agree. Opt-out means that you can do nothing, then we assume you agree, okay? And in terms of knowing your rights, it's great that the law gives data users a lot of rights, but very few people actually use those rights. If you look at CCPA, which is a California law of privacy ineffective in 2020, if I remember correctly, only 200 to 300 requests per million data subjects occur for any purpose under that law in 2021. However, to address each request, it requires an average cost of $1,500. And so this is like, we give the rights, very few people exercise the rights, but exercise rights is very costly on the supply side. And we don't know exactly who and how many have registered with the Israel Registrar of Data. Okay, and then you say, okay, now maybe those information only regulation does not work well. Let's try to have other more stringent regulations such as minimum quality standard. Okay, so this is why the GDPR requires privacy by design. Some countries like South Korea even require liability in data sharing. That's if you're a data controller, collect the original data, you have to sign the contract before you share data with a third party, and you actually would have some legal responsibility if that third party have misused that data. Okay, and we have laws targeting bad players or vulnerable population like US COPPA or FOSTR law for sex trafficking. And lastly, I want to just emphasize that a lot of countries try to restrict data exports for national security reasons or for protection of their subjects reasons. Let me just give you an example of how things might go sort of not exactly as planned. For example, India require localization of financial data, okay? And that was in 2018. And then in 2021, the Central Bank of India claimed that MasterCard, American Express just violate that law because they do not just localize the financial data, and therefore they cannot issue card to any new members. And that list was only sort of removed in 2022. And just 1 month ago, Ireland has fined Meta for 1.2 euro for violating the data transfer from EU to the US because the EU and US cannot reach agreement of data sharing pact. So we see a form of sort of going into globalization of data sharing, as well as different regulators try to restrict their data access from their country borders and so forth. So there are a lot of catches in those regulations as well. High compliance cost, it's difficult to enforce. Different agencies have different enforcement, and the law become fragmented, and sometimes the law are even conflicting. Okay, so I will leave this page on here, given that I'm running out of time. But the bottom line is that we have seen a lot of regulators try to put an effort to regulate the potential market failures here. However, every choice that people have tried seem to have some catch. So it's very important that we may want to think about the exactly how we as a society can navigate this area. Thank you.